On the day my wife and I were to get married, I found myself reborn with a peculiar ability. I could hear the thoughts of others. So there I was, standing at the altar like some kind of discount Prince Charming, waiting for what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Yeah, right. If someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be marrying into the Parker family, the same bunch of corporate sharks who could smell weakness from 3 zip codes away, I would have laughed until my ribs cracked. But here's the thing about life. It's got a twisted sense of humor, and apparently, I was the punchline. The St. Augustine Cathedral was packed tighter than a New York subway during rush hour, filled with people who probably had more money in their checking accounts than most folks see in a lifetime. Designer suits, diamond earrings that could blind a pilot, and enough fake smiles to power a small city. Classic high society wedding stuff, you know? The kind where everyone's measuring everyone else's net worth while pretending to care about love and commitment. Selena looked absolutely stunning walking down that aisle. I'll give her that. Her dress probably cost more than my first car. Hell, maybe my first 2 cars combined. Every step she took was calculated, graceful, like she was floating on air instead of walking on marble. The photographer was having a field day, snapping away like his life depended on it. This was going to be front-page material for all the society magazines, no doubt about it. But then something weird happened. I'm talking Stephen King-level weird. It started as this tingling sensation in the back of my skull, like when your foot falls asleep, but way more intense. Then it felt like someone was slowly turning up the volume on a radio I didn't know I had. Suddenly, I could hear everything. Not just the organ music or the rustling of expensive fabric. I could hear thoughts. Actual, honest-to-God thoughts floating around in people's heads like invisible confessions. At first, I figured I was having some kind of panic attack. Wedding jitters, right? Happens to the best of us. Maybe I'd had one too many whiskey shots with my groomsmen before the ceremony. But no, this was different. Crystal clear, like someone had installed high-definition speakers directly into my brain. Selena reached the altar, and when she took my hands, her smile was perfect. Magazine cover perfect. Her lips were moving, saying all the right words about love and devotion and building a life together. But inside her head, oh man, inside her head was a whole different conversation going on. At least this time I'll get the better deal than my sister. Wait, what? I almost choked on my own spit right there in front of 300 wedding guests. Better deal than her sister? What the hell was that supposed to mean? I kept my poker face locked in place. Thank God for all those family dinners where I'd learned to smile through passive-aggressive comments. But my mind was racing faster than a NASCAR driver on Red Bull. That's when I made the mistake of glancing over at Marissa, Selena's younger sister, who was standing there in her bridesmaid dress looking like she'd rather be getting a root canal. The glare she was shooting my way could have melted steel, but it was what I heard from her head that really knocked me sideways. Selena always takes what should have been mine. If only I'd moved faster, Adrian would have been mine too. Hold up. Pump the brakes. Rewind that tape. Marissa had wanted me. Since when? I'd known the Parker sisters for almost 2 years, and not once had Marissa shown any interest beyond basic politeness. If anything, she'd always seemed kind of annoyed whenever I was around, like I was some stray dog that had wandered into their pristine world and refused to leave. But apparently, there was a whole soap opera playing out behind those perfectly applied makeup masks that I'd been completely oblivious to. Sisters competing over me. Me, Adrian Matthews, the guy who still bought his suits off the rack at Men's Warehouse and thought a fancy dinner was Olive Garden with breadsticks. The minister kept droning on about love and commitment and all that traditional wedding stuff, but I was having my own private revelation. This wasn't just some random brain malfunction or wedding day stress. This was real. I was actually hearing people's thoughts, their real thoughts, not the polished versions they presented to the world. And let me tell you, it was like finding out that everyone around you has been speaking a different language this whole time, and you'd just been nodding along pretending to understand. I forced myself to focus on the ceremony, to go through the motions. When it was time for my vows, I managed to deliver them without my voice cracking, even though my brain felt like it was doing cartwheels. I talked about love and partnership and building something beautiful together, all while hearing Selena's mental commentary about making sure this marriage worked out better for her than it had for other people. What other people? What was I missing here? The ring exchange went smoothly enough, though I caught fragments of thoughts from various guests. Uncle Robert wondering if I'd signed a prenup. Cousin Jennifer betting I wouldn't last 6 months. Great Aunt Millicent thinking I looked too skinny and needed more meat on my bones. It was like having access to the world's most brutally honest focus group. When the minister finally pronounced us husband and wife, and I kissed Selena for the first time as her legal spouse, I heard her think, well, that's step 1 complete. Step 1 of what? What kind of master plan was my new wife running? As we walked back down the aisle together, her arm linked through mine, I caught more mental chatter from the crowd. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Comments about the dress, the flowers, the music, who looked good and who didn't. But scattered throughout were these little nuggets of information that painted a very different picture of what this whole event meant to everyone involved. The photographer positioned us for what felt like a million different shots on the cathedral steps. Selena's smile never wavered, not once. She was a professional at this stuff, I realized. Every angle was perfect, every expression calculated for maximum impact. Meanwhile, I was trying not to look like a deer caught in headlights while simultaneously processing the fact that I could apparently read minds now. Smile bigger, Adrian, the photographer called out. This is supposed to be the happiest day of your life. If only he knew that it was actually turning out to be the most confusing day of my life. But as I stood there, arm around my new wife, listening to the mental symphony of 300 wedding guests, something clicked into place. This wasn't a curse. This wasn't some cosmic joke being played on me. This was an opportunity, a chance to finally understand what was really going on in the world around me, to see past all the bullshit and social niceties and get to the truth of things. For the first time in my life, I had a real advantage. And as I looked out at all those faces, some genuine, some fake, all hiding their real thoughts behind practiced expressions, I realized that this was my second chance. My opportunity to rewrite the story of my life, armed with information that nobody else knew I had. The game had changed, and finally, I knew the rules. If I thought the ceremony was a trip, the reception was like being dropped into the middle of a Broadway show where everyone knew their lines except me. The Parker family had rented out the entire grand ballroom at the Ritz-Carlton, because God forbid we celebrate somewhere that didn't require a credit check just to walk through the door. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like expensive tears, and the floral arrangements probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. But here's the kicker. Now that I had this bizarre new superpower, the whole event felt like watching a movie with director's commentary turned on. Except instead of learning about camera angles and lighting, I was getting a crash course in just how fake everyone around me really was. The receiving line was pure torture. Person after person came up to shake my hand and offer congratulations, their mouths saying one thing while their brains broadcast something completely different. Mrs. Henderson from the country club gushed about how beautiful the ceremony was while thinking about how my tuxedo looked cheap compared to what her son-in-law had worn. Mr. Whitman from the golf course told me I was a lucky man while mentally calculating whether I'd be worth networking with or if I was just arm candy for Selena. But the real entertainment started when Selena's brothers made their grand entrance into the receiving line. Dominic Parker strode up first, and let me tell you, this guy was like a walking advertisement for expensive cologne and cold shoulders. Tall, perfectly groomed, with the kind of sharp suit that screamed, I could buy and sell you before lunch. He'd barely acknowledged my existence during the engagement period, treating me like some random dude Selena had picked up at a coffee shop instead of the guy who was about to become his brother-in-law. His handshake was firm, too firm, like he was trying to prove something. And his smile was about as warm as a freezer burn. Welcome to the family, Adrian, he said, his voice carrying all the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. But his thoughts? Oh man, his thoughts were a whole different story. This man won't last in our family. He'll crumble like the others. The others? What others? How many guys had the Parker family chewed up and spit out? And what exactly did he mean by crumble? Was there some kind of hazing process I wasn't aware of? A secret Parker family initiation where they broke down outsiders until they either fell in line or fell apart. I kept my smile plastered on and squeezed his hand right back, maybe a little harder than necessary. Thanks, Dominic. Looking forward to getting to know the family better. His eyes narrowed slightly, like he was trying to figure out if there was some hidden meaning in my words. If only he knew that I was the one with access to hidden meanings now. Then came Lucas. And this guy was like Dominic's polar opposite. Where his older brother was all sharp edges and intimidation tactics, Lucas was warmth and charm turned up to 11. He pulled me into one of those backslapping bro hugs that politicians love so much, his smile wide enough to power a small city. "Adrian, my man, welcome to the crazy Parker circus." He laughed like we were old friends, like we'd been hanging out since college instead of having maybe a dozen conversations over the past 2 years. "Hope you're ready for the ride of your life, brother." The crowd around us chuckled at his infectious energy. Lucas had always been the family favorite at social events, the one who could work a room like a professional politician, making everyone feel like they were the most important person in the world. If Dominic was the corporate hammer, Lucas was the velvet glove. But then I heard his thoughts, and my blood turned to ice water. "Sooner or later, Adrian's place will be mine." What the hell did that mean? His place would be what exactly? My place as Selena's husband? My place in the family business? My place 6 feet underground? The smile on Lucas's face never wavered, not even for a second. He kept laughing and joking with the other guests, playing the role of the charming younger brother to perfection. But knowing what was really going on in his head made every friendly gesture feel like a threat wrapped in a bow. I was starting to understand that this wasn't just a wedding reception, it was a performance. Everyone was playing their part in some elaborate theater production, and I was the only one who didn't have a script. The evening continued with all the usual wedding nonsense. Dinner was served on plates that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, with courses I couldn't even pronounce. The band played all the classics while couples swayed on the dance floor, looking like something out of a romantic movie. Everything was picture-perfect, magazine-worthy, absolutely flawless. Except for the mental soundtrack I was picking up from everyone around me. During dinner, I sat at the head table between Selena and her mother, Evelyn. Selena kept her hand on my arm throughout the meal, the perfect picture of a blushing bride. She'd lean over occasionally to whisper sweet nothings in my ear, little comments about how wonderful everything was and how happy she felt. But her internal monologue was running on a completely different track. "Stay useful, Adrian. Don't embarrass me tonight." Useful. That was the word that kept bouncing around in her head. Not beloved or cherished or any of the other words you'd expect from a new bride. Useful. Like I was some kind of tool she'd picked up to accomplish a specific job. When it came time for the toasts, I knew I was expected to say something meaningful. The band quieted down, the crowd turned their attention to the head table, and everyone waited for the groom's speech. I stood up, champagne glass in hand, feeling like I was about to perform without a net. Friends, family, and I paused, looking out at the sea of faces, people who are probably wondering how I managed to convince someone as amazing as Selena to marry me. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. I could hear mental agreement from about half the room. They say marriage is about finding your other half, but I think it's really about finding someone who makes you want to be better than you are. Someone who challenges you, supports you, and occasionally puts up with your terrible taste in movies. More laughter, warmer this time. Even some genuine smiles. "Selena, you've already made me a better man just by believing I was worth your time. I promise to spend the rest of our lives proving that your faith in me wasn't misplaced." I raised my glass, and the crowd followed suit. To new beginnings, to family, and to whatever adventures come next. The applause was genuine, the smiles seemed real, and for a moment, I almost forgot about all the mental commentary I'd been picking up. Almost. As I sat back down, Selena squeezed my hand and leaned over to kiss my cheek. "That was perfect," she whispered. In her head, I heard, "Good. He can speak in public without humiliating himself. That's something, at least." Yeah, this was definitely going to be interesting. You know what they say about wedding nights, right? All that romantic nonsense about passion and intimacy and starting your new life together in a blaze of matrimonial glory? Yeah, well, whoever came up with that clearly never married into the Parker family, because my wedding night went about as smoothly as a train wreck in slow motion. We'd finally escaped the reception around midnight, after what felt like 17 hours of fake smiles and air kisses from people who probably couldn't remember my name if their trust funds depended on it. I was exhausted, slightly buzzed from champagne, and honestly looking forward to finally being alone with my new wife. You know, maybe having an actual conversation without 300 people watching our every move. The Parker estate was one of those old money mansions that looked like it had been stolen from a period drama and plopped down in the Connecticut countryside. All ivy-covered walls and imposing columns, with enough rooms to house a small army and probably enough hidden passages to make a ghost jealous. Selena led me through the front entrance like she owned the place, which, technically, I guess she did, while I tried not to gawk like some tourist who'd wandered off the guided tour. "So," I said, loosening my tie as we climbed the grand staircase, "which room is ours?" Selena glanced back at me with this weird little smile. "The blue suite, end of the hall." "But Adrian." She paused on the landing, and for a second, I thought maybe she was going to say something real, something honest. "Don't get too comfortable." Before I could ask what the hell that was supposed to mean, the front door opened again, and in walked Dominic, still wearing his wedding tuxedo like he was heading to another event instead of going home after his sister's reception. He wasn't alone, either. Trailing behind him were Gerald Parker, Selena's father, and some guy in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on the planet. "Ah, perfect timing," Dominic called out, not bothering with pleasantries. "Adrian, we need to discuss some contracts before the night gets too late." I blinked. "Contracts? Tonight?" "Business doesn't stop for sentiment," Gerald said, his voice carrying that particular brand of cold authority that rich old men seemed to perfect. He was already heading toward what I assumed was his study, not bothering to check if we were following. "Now, here's where things get interesting. In my previous life, and yeah, I'm starting to think of everything before this mind-reading thing as my previous life, I would have absolutely lost my shit at this point. I mean, come on. It's my wedding night. I'm trying to figure out what the hell kind of marriage I've just gotten myself into, and these guys want to talk business?" I would have stormed out, probably said something about respect and boundaries, and generally made an ass of myself. But this time was different. This time, I had a front row seat to everyone's real thoughts, and what I was hearing was way more valuable than whatever wounded pride I might have been nursing. "Of course," I said, straightening my tie instead of loosening it further. "Lead the way." Selena's eyebrows shot up like I'd just announced I was joining the circus. I caught her thought clear as day. Is he scared of me? Or clever enough not to push? Clever. Definitely going with clever. The study was exactly what you'd expect from a family that probably had more money than some small countries. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened, and a desk the size of my first apartment. Gerald settled behind it like a king on his throne, while Dominic took one of the chairs facing him. The suit guy, who I was beginning to suspect was some kind of lawyer, positioned himself off to the side with a briefcase that probably contained my financial future. I took the remaining chair and waited. In situations like this, the guy who talks first usually loses, and I was getting the distinct impression that this whole meeting was some kind of test. "Adrian," Gerald began, his fingers steepled in front of him, "now that you're officially part of the Parker family, there are certain arrangements that need to be formalized." The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of papers thick enough to choke a horse. "Standard post-nuptial documentation," he said in the kind of monotone voice that suggested he'd done this dance before. "Financial boundaries, business interests, inheritance protocols." I nodded like this was all perfectly normal, even though my brain was screaming that none of this should be happening at midnight on my wedding night. But the mental commentary I was picking up was way more interesting than whatever legal mumbo-jumbo they were about to throw at me. Gerald's thoughts were crystal clear. Let's see how he handles pressure. The last one folded immediately. The last one, again with the mysterious previous victims of the Parker family machine. Dominic was thinking along similar lines. If he's smart, he'll take what we offer and stay in his lane. If he's stupid, well, we've dealt with stupid before. The threats weren't even subtle at this point. These guys were basically telling me that I could play by their rules or get steamrolled, and they were betting I'd fold like a cheap lawn chair. I listened to their whole presentation, something about a modest allowance, limited access to family resources, and enough legal restrictions to make sure I couldn't cause any real damage if things went south. Standard rich family stuff, designed to protect their assets from gold-digging in-laws. When they finished, I just sat there for a moment, letting the silence stretch out. All three of them were watching me like hawks, waiting to see how I'd react. "Sounds reasonable," I said finally, and I could practically feel their collective relief. "But I'm curious, is this how all the family business gets handled? Middle of the night meetings in the study? Gerald actually smiled at that, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him all night. In his head, I heard, at least this one isn't crying or threatening to call a lawyer. Maybe he'll work out after all. Welcome to the family, Adrian, Dominic said, and for the first time, his handshake felt less like a threat and more like acknowledgement. When I finally made it back upstairs, Selena was already in bed, reading some magazine about interior design. She looked up when I came in, her expression unreadable. How did it go? She asked. Educational, I said, heading for the couch by the window. She watched me grab a pillow and a throw blanket from the chair. What are you doing? Figured I'd take the couch tonight. Long day, you know. Her mental response was immediate. Is he being considerate, or is he afraid of me? Neither, actually. I was being strategic. This marriage was clearly a business arrangement dressed up in white lace and wedding cake, and the sooner I accepted that, the sooner I could figure out how to play the game to win. Good night, Selena, I said, settling onto the couch. Good night, Adrian. As I lay there in the dark, listening to her breathing even out, I realized something important. Everyone in this family was playing a long game, thinking 3 moves ahead while pretending to care about things like love and family loyalty. Well, guess what? 2 could play that game. And this time, I had an advantage they didn't even know existed. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be a goldfish dropped into a shark tank, let me paint you a picture. That's basically what my first month as a Parker felt like, except the sharks wore designer suits and the water was made of liquid money. But here's the thing about being a goldfish with mind-reading superpowers. You get to hear exactly what the sharks are planning before they take a bite. I threw myself into learning the Parker Empire like my life depended on it, which, let's be honest, it probably did. Every morning at 7 sharp, I'd show up to the family breakfast meetings in the formal dining room, armed with coffee strong enough to wake the dead and a notepad that I pretended to take notes in. Really, I was just doodling while I listened to the most expensive soap opera on the East Coast play out in real time. These weren't your typical family breakfast conversations, either. Forget discussing weekend plans or complaining about the weather. The Parkers talked mergers and acquisitions over their organic free-range eggs, debated hostile takeovers while passing the artisanal jam, and planned corporate warfare between bites of toast that probably cost more per slice than most people's lunch. Selena would sit there looking like she'd stepped out of a business magazine, perfectly put together even at 7 in the morning, offering insights that made it clear she'd inherited more than just her father's cheekbones. Dominic dominated most conversations with the kind of commanding presence that made junior executives wet themselves, while Lucas played the role of the charming diplomat, smoothing over his brother's rougher edges with jokes and strategic compliments. And then there was me, the new guy, sitting at the end of the table like some kind of corporate mascot, nodding along and trying not to look completely lost when they started throwing around terms like leveraged buyouts and synergistic value propositions. But here's where my newfound superpower came in handy. While everyone was focused on looking important and sounding smart, I was getting the real story straight from their heads. Take the meeting where they were discussing the quarterly reports from their various subsidiaries. On the surface, it was all very professional. Charts and graphs and PowerPoint presentations that would make a McKinsey consultant weep with joy. Gerald ran through the numbers with the kind of dry precision that could cure insomnia, while everyone nodded and made appropriately serious faces. Subsidiary 1 was performing above expectations, thanks to some new contracts in the overseas market. Subsidiary 2 was holding steady, nothing spectacular, but nothing to worry about either. And then they got to Subsidiary 3, and suddenly the room got as quiet as a funeral parlor. Subsidiary 3 continues to underperform, Gerald said, his voice carrying about as much emotion as a tax form. Revenue is down 18% from last quarter, employee turnover is at an all-time high, and client satisfaction surveys are, well, let's just say they're not great. Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression suggesting he'd rather be discussing anything else. Maybe it's time to cut our losses. Some investments just don't pan out. That's when I heard the real conversation happening in his head. This division has been a money pit for 3 years. Everyone knows it's dead weight, but nobody wants to be the one to pull the trigger. Lucas nodded along with his brother's assessment, but his mental commentary was way more interesting. If we shut it down, that's 200 jobs gone and a lot of bad press. But if we keep throwing money at it, we're just delaying the inevitable. Even Selena was mentally writing the obituary. Dad's pet project finally dying. About time. Maybe now we can focus on the divisions that actually make money. But as I sat there, listening to them all mentally bury Subsidiary 3, something clicked in my brain. See, while they were all focused on the big picture, the prestigious contracts and high-profile clients, I'd been doing my homework on the smaller stuff. And Subsidiary 3 wasn't dead, it was just sleeping. The problems weren't with the core business model, they were with execution. Management had been treating it like the red-headed stepchild of the Parker Empire, starving it of resources while expecting it to compete with divisions that got all the attention and investment. It was like expecting a racehorse to win the Kentucky Derby while feeding it table scraps. But the potential was there. I'd spend hours going through their client lists, their service offerings, their market positioning. They were in a niche that nobody else was really paying attention to. Mid-sized businesses that were too big for the mom-and-pop consultants, but too small for the major firms to bother with. It was like finding a $20 bill that everyone had overlooked because it was crumpled up in the corner. What if we tried a different approach? I said, and suddenly every head in the room turned toward me like I'd just announced I was running for president. Gerald raised an eyebrow. You have thoughts on Subsidiary 3, Adrian? Here's where things got interesting. In my old life, I would have probably stammered out some half-baked idea and then retreated when faced with their skeptical stares. But armed with the knowledge of what everyone was really thinking, I had a completely different kind of confidence. I've been looking at their numbers, I said, keeping my voice steady. The problem isn't that there's no market for what they're offering. The problem is that they're trying to compete in the wrong market. Dominic's mental response was immediate. Great, the new guy thinks he's a business genius. This should be entertaining. But Gerald's thoughts were more curious. Let's see what he's got. Worst case, he embarrasses himself and we move on. I pulled out the folder I'd been carrying around for the past week, filled with research I'd done during my late-night study sessions. They're positioned as a boutique consulting firm, trying to go head-to-head with companies that have 10 times their resources. But what if we reposition them as specialists? Target the mid-market companies that are being ignored by the big players. I walked them through my analysis. How Subsidiary 3 could pivot to focus on businesses with revenues between 10 and 50 million, companies that were too sophisticated for generic solutions, but too small to interest the major consulting firms. It was a sweet spot that nobody was really dominating, and with the right marketing and a few strategic hires, they could own that niche within 2 years. As I talked, I could hear the mental reactions shifting around the table. Skepticism was slowly giving way to curiosity, and curiosity was starting to look a lot like interest. When I finished my presentation, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Gerald spoke up. That's actually not terrible, he said, and I heard his real thought. The boy might actually have a brain in his head. Interesting. Dominic was still skeptical, but even his mental commentary was grudging. It's not the worst idea I've heard. Might actually work if executed properly. And Lucas? His thoughts made me want to watch my back even more carefully. Smart play. Makes himself useful while taking on a project nobody else wants. Clever. Give me 6 months, I said, looking directly at Gerald. Let me take a hands-on role with Subsidiary 3. If I can't turn it around, you can shut it down and I'll take the blame. Selena's mental reaction was immediate. Is he insane? He's volunteering for a suicide mission. But Gerald was already nodding slowly. 6 months, he said. But you'll be held accountable for results, not effort. Understood, I said. As the meeting broke up and everyone filed out of the dining room, I caught one more thought from Evelyn, who'd been sitting quietly through the whole discussion. Maybe this one won't be useless after all. High praise from the Parker matriarch. That afternoon, I packed up my stuff and headed over to the Subsidiary 3 offices across town. It was time to see if I could turn my golden opportunity into actual gold. A week later, I got my first real taste of how the Parker family handled business, and let me tell you, it was like watching a group of lawyers play poker with someone else's soul. I should have seen it coming, honestly. Nothing in this family happened without paperwork, and apparently that included making sure their newest member knew exactly where he stood in the pecking order. The summons came via Evelyn's personal assistant, a woman named Margaret who looked like she could organize a military coup before lunch and still have time to alphabetize the filing cabinets. She appeared at my temporary office at Subsidiary 3 with all the warmth of an Arctic wind, carrying an envelope that practically screamed legal documents from 50 feet away. "Mrs. Parker requests your presence in the main conference room at 2 o'clock, Margaret announced, her voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested this wasn't really a request. "Please bring your attorney." My attorney? I didn't have an attorney. Hell, the closest thing I had to legal representation was the guy who'd helped me refinance my car loan 2 years ago, and I was pretty sure his specialty was more affordable monthly payments than high-stakes family contract negotiations. "I'll be there," I said, trying to sound like this was totally normal, and I definitely had a lawyer on speed dial. Margaret gave me a look that suggested she knew exactly how screwed I was, nodded curtly, and disappeared like some kind of corporate ninja. 2 hours later, I found myself sitting in the Parker family conference room, which looked like it had been designed by someone who thought intimidation was an interior design style. The table was massive enough to land a small plane on, surrounded by chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the manicured estate grounds, and oil paintings of dead Parker ancestors glared down from the walls like they were personally offended by my presence. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, looking like she'd stepped out of a boardroom magazine spread. To her right sat some guy in a suit that screamed expensive lawyer, flanked by what I assumed were additional legal reinforcements. Gerald was there, naturally, along with Dominic, who looked like he was trying not to smirk. And then there was Marissa, sitting off to the side like she was watching a particularly entertaining tennis match. "Adrian," Evelyn began, her voice carrying the kind of polite formality that rich people used when they were about to screw you over with maximum courtesy. "Now that you've had time to settle into the family, we thought it would be appropriate to formalize certain arrangements." The lead lawyer, who introduced himself as Pemberton something or other from the kind of law firm that charged more per hour than most people made in a month, slid a document across the table that was thick enough to stop a bullet. "A post-nuptial agreement," Pemberton explained in the tone of voice that suggested this was all perfectly routine. "Standard provisions for asset protection and financial boundaries within the marriage." I picked up the document and started flipping through it, trying to look like I understood more than maybe 30% of the legal jargon. But here's the thing about having mind-reading powers. You don't need to understand the fine print when you can hear exactly what everyone's thinking about the big picture. Evelyn's mental commentary was brutal in its simplicity: a generous monthly allowance and one property upon dissolution of marriage. More than fair for someone who brought nothing to the table. Dominic was thinking along similar lines. The allowance is more than he was probably making before, and the property clause ensures he can't claim any real stake in the business if things go south. But it was Marissa's thoughts that really caught my attention. Once he's tied down, he'll have nothing when Selena's done with him. Just like the others. There it was again, the mysterious others. How many guys had been through this exact same process? How many had sat in this chair, looking at this same contract, thinking they were getting a fair deal? Gerald's mental voice was matter of fact. "We've learned from experience. Better to establish boundaries early than deal with messy complications later." I kept reading, noting the key provisions. A monthly allowance that was, admittedly, more than I'd been making at my previous job. Access to one of the family's smaller properties. A condo in the city that was probably worth more than I'd see in a lifetime. Healthcare, some investment accounts. All the basic stuff you'd expect. But zero stake in the actual Parker business empire. Zero input on major family decisions. Zero anything that would give me real power or influence beyond what they chose to grant me. "This is very generous," I said finally, setting the document down. "But I'd like to propose something different." The room went so quiet you could have heard a pin drop in the next county. I caught multiple mental reactions at once: surprise, confusion, and what felt like barely contained amusement from Marissa. "Different how?" Evelyn asked, her voice carefully neutral. I leaned back in my chair, trying to project confidence I didn't entirely feel. "The allowance and property are generous, but they're essentially golden handcuffs. Instead, I'd like to propose a performance-based arrangement." Pemberton's eyebrows shot up like I'd just suggested we all start juggling. "Performance-based? Give me 10% ownership of Subsidiary 3, I said, and I could practically feel the collective mental response of everyone in the room. "But only if I can turn it profitable within 12 months. If I succeed, I keep the stake. If I fail, I get nothing. No allowance, no property, no safety net. The silence stretched out long enough to film a nature documentary about it. I could hear thoughts flying around the room like pinballs in a machine. Evelyn's mind was practically screaming. Arrogant fool. Perfect. He'll bury himself, and we won't even have to pay him for the privilege. Gerald was more analytical. Interesting gamble. Either he succeeds and proves himself useful, or he fails and eliminates himself as a potential problem. Dominic's reaction was the most telling. He wants to tie his future to the one division everyone expects to fail. Either he's stupider than I thought, or he knows something we don't. But it was Marissa's mental celebration that really sealed the deal for me. Yes, he's volunteering to destroy himself. This is even better than I hoped. That's quite a proposal, Evelyn said slowly. You're essentially wagering your entire future on a failing business division. I am, I said, but I'm also betting on myself, which is more than this contract does. Gerald spoke up for the first time since I'd arrived. And if you fail? If Subsidiary 3 continues to hemorrhage money and we're forced to shut it down, then I walk away with nothing and you never have to see me again, I said. Clean break. No alimony, no complications. I could see the wheels turning in everyone's heads. From their perspective, this was a win-win situation. Either I somehow managed to turn around a business division that had been circling the drain for 3 years, which they clearly considered impossible, or I'd essentially volunteer to remove myself from their lives without costing them a dime. Evelyn looked at Gerald, who looked at Dominic, who shrugged like he was watching someone volunteer to jump off a cliff. 12 months, Evelyn said finally. But we'll need very specific performance metrics. Profitability isn't enough. We're talking about sustained revenue growth, client retention, market expansion. Agreed, I said. And if you fail, Dominic added, the failure has to be complete. No partial credit. No almost profitable. No excuses. Understood. Pemberton looked like he was watching a man sign his own death warrant, but he dutifully started making notes about revising the contract. This is highly irregular, he muttered. Life's irregular, I said. That's what makes it interesting. As the meeting broke up and everyone filed out, I caught one last mental comment from Evelyn. 12 months to prove he's not another disappointment. At least this way, when he fails, it'll be spectacular. Little did she know, I wasn't planning to fail. I was planning to rewrite the rules of the game entirely. And I had the advantage of knowing exactly what everyone expected me to do, which meant I could do the exact opposite and catch them all off guard. Game on, Parker family. Game on. If you've ever walked into a building that's been slowly dying for years, you know that particular smell, part stale coffee, part broken dreams, with just a hint of, what the hell happened here? That's exactly what hit me when I walked into the Subsidiary 3 offices for my first day as the guy supposedly crazy enough to think he could resurrect this corporate zombie. The place looked like a museum exhibit titled, How Not to Run a Business. Fluorescent lights flickered like they were having seizures. The carpet had seen better decades, and half the cubicles sat empty like some kind of office apocalypse had swept through and taken the smart people with it. The few employees who remained looked like survivors of a particularly brutal corporate downsizing, going through the motions while mentally updating their resumes. I called an all-hands meeting for 10 o'clock, which in this place meant rounding up all 12 remaining employees and cramming them into a conference room that smelled like defeated ambition and cheap air freshener. Looking at their faces was like staring at a support group for people who'd given up on life but couldn't afford to quit their jobs. All right, people, I said, standing at the front of the room like some kind of discount motivational speaker. I know things have been rough around here. I know morale is in the toilet, the budget's tighter than a Kardashian's dress, and half of you are probably wondering if I'm here to put the final nail in the coffin. A few nervous chuckles, but mostly just the kind of dead-eyed stares you get from people who've heard this speech before and watched it end with pink slips and cardboard boxes. I'm not here to punish anyone, I continued. I'm not here to point fingers or assign blame or figure out whose fault it is that this place looks like the set of a disaster movie. I'm here to build something new. That got their attention. I could practically hear the mental gears turning as they tried to figure out if I was serious or just another corporate suit blowing smoke up their asses. But here's the thing, and I'm going to be brutally honest with you because that's the only way this works. We're starting from zero. Worse than zero, actually. We're starting from a hole that's been getting deeper for 3 years, and the only way out is to work our asses off and prove that everyone who wrote us off was wrong. I paused, looking around the room at faces that were slowly shifting from resignation to something that might have been curiosity. I can't promise you job security, because honestly, if we don't turn this around in the next 12 months, there won't be any jobs to secure. But I can promise you this. If you're willing to work, if you're willing to take risks and try new things and maybe fail a few times before we get it right, then we're going to build something here that nobody expects. The questions started flying immediately. What was the plan? What resources did we have? What exactly did turning things around look like in concrete terms? I spent the next 2 hours laying out my vision for repositioning the company. We were going to stop trying to be a discount version of the big consulting firms and start being the go-to specialists for mid-market companies. We were going to focus on businesses that were too big for the mom-and-pop consultants, but too small for McKinsey to care about. Companies with revenues between 10 and 50 million that needed real expertise but couldn't afford the big-name premium. By the end of the meeting, I could see something I hadn't expected: actual interest. These people had been so beaten down by years of decline that the idea of actually having a strategy, a real plan for growth, was like offering water to people who'd been lost in the desert. Over the next few weeks, I brought in reinforcements. Noah Chun, a data analyst I'd worked with at my previous job, who could make spreadsheets sing opera and spot trends that other people missed entirely. Isha Patel, a marketing genius who'd been wasted at a mid-tier firm, with ideas about digital strategy that could make a monk go viral. And Tomas Rodriguez, a client relations specialist who could charm the paint off a wall and make customers feel like they were the most important people in the world. We started small, really small. Like, let's see if we can land one new client this month small. But that's how you rebuild something that's been broken, piece by piece, success by success, until people start believing that maybe, just maybe, this crazy plan might actually work. The first month was brutal. We were working 12-hour days, living on coffee and takeout, trying to rebuild systems that had been held together with duct tape and wishful thinking. I was pulling in favors from every contact I'd made in my previous career, pitching to companies that had never heard of us, trying to convince people that a consulting firm on life support could somehow solve their problems. But then something weird started happening. We began getting results. Small ones at first, a client retention project here, a process optimization contract there, but real, measurable wins that showed up on the bottom line. The mood in the office started shifting from funeral parlor to something that almost resembled optimism. That's when the sabotage started. It began with little things. Roses appearing on my desk with no card attached, like some kind of creepy secret admirer situation. I'd hear whispers in the mental background. Fragments of thoughts about setting him up for scandal and let the press eat him alive. Someone was definitely gunning for me, but they were being subtle about it. The sprinkler incident wasn't subtle at all. I came in one Monday morning to find our entire records room flooded. Not just damp, completely soaked, with water still dripping from the ceiling and filing cabinets that looked like they'd been through a hurricane. The official story was a malfunction in the sprinkler system, but I caught a crystal-clear thought from Marissa when she stopped by to see how we were handling the crisis. Try saving it now. Her mind was practically singing with satisfaction. What she didn't know was that I'd learned from watching the Parker family operate. You always have backups. Always. Every important document, every client file, every piece of data that mattered was stored digitally in 3 different locations, including an off-site server that could survive a nuclear apocalypse. By Friday, we were fully operational again, and our response time to the crisis had actually impressed a few potential clients who'd heard about the flood. Nothing says reliable business partner like bouncing back from disaster without missing a beat. When Marissa showed up that Friday afternoon, expecting to find us packing boxes and updating our LinkedIn profiles, the look on her face was worth every hour of sleep I'd lost that week. I smiled at her from behind my desk, surrounded by the hum of a fully functional office, and watched her thoughts dissolve into panic. How is this possible? Her mind was screaming. Everything should be destroyed. Thanks for stopping by, Marissa, I said cheerfully. Always nice to see family taking an interest in the business. She left without saying a word. but I could practically hear her mental wheels spinning as she tried to figure out what had gone wrong with her sabotage attempt. That night, as I locked up the office and headed home, I realized something important. The Parker family had spent so much time playing defense, protecting what they had, that they'd forgotten how to play offense. They were used to people who could be intimidated, bought off, or simply worn down by the grind. They weren't used to people who fought back, and they definitely weren't used to people who could hear them planning their next move. The Parker family's annual charity gala was the kind of event that made the Met Gala look like a church bake sale. We're talking about 500 of the richest, most powerful people on the East Coast, all crammed into the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, wearing enough diamonds to blind a satellite and dropping more money on silent auction items than most people made in a year. It was conspicuous consumption disguised as philanthropy, and everyone played their part like they were auditioning for roles in lifestyles of the rich and shameless. I'd been dreading this thing for weeks. Not because I couldn't handle a fancy party. Hell, after 6 months of dealing with Parker family dynamics, I could probably charm my way through a dinner with serial killers. No, I was nervous because events like this were breeding grounds for the kind of social warfare that the Parkers had turned into an art form, and I had a feeling that tonight was going to be the night someone decided to make their move. Selena looked absolutely stunning in a midnight blue gown that probably cost more than a luxury car, moving through the crowd like she owned the place, which, technically, her family kind of did. She'd been playing the perfect supportive wife all evening, hanging on my arm and making small talk with society matrons who could buy small countries if the mood struck them. But I could hear the undercurrent of tension in everyone's thoughts. There was something brewing tonight, something bigger than the usual petty gossip and social maneuvering that typically dominated these events. The evening started normally enough. Cocktail hour featured the usual suspects: investment bankers comparing yacht sizes, real estate moguls discussing their latest acquisitions, and politicians working the room like they were running for office. I played my part, making conversation about market trends and shaking hands with people whose net worth had more zeros than a mathematician's fever dream. Gerald was holding court near the bar, surrounded by a cluster of business leaders who hung on his every word like he was dispensing financial gospel. Evelyn was working the room with surgical precision, making sure to speak to everyone who mattered while gracefully avoiding anyone who didn't. Dominic and Lucas were tag-teaming various groups, playing their usual good cop/bad cop routine with potential business partners. I was halfway through a conversation with some hedge fund manager about overseas investment opportunities when I caught a fragment of thought from across the room that made my blood run cold. Tonight's the night. Finally going to show everyone what the Parker family really is. The thought came from somewhere in the crowd, but with all the mental chatter bouncing around the ballroom, I couldn't pinpoint the source. All I knew was that someone was planning something big, and it wasn't going to be pretty. I excused myself from the hedge fund conversation and started moving through the crowd, trying to look casual while listening for more details. The problem with events like this is that everyone's thinking about a dozen different things at once: stock prices, social climbing, who's sleeping with whom. So finding one specific threat is like trying to find a needle in a haystack made of other needles. Then I saw him. Leo Castellanos, some mid-level tech entrepreneur who'd been trying to break into the Parker family's inner circle for years, was standing near the auction tables with a tablet in his hands and a look on his face that screamed, "I'm about to do something really stupid." His thoughts were crystal clear and absolutely terrifying. Time to show everyone the real Parker financials. Let's see how charitable they feel when the world knows where their money really comes from. Oh shit. I started moving toward him, but I was on the opposite side of the ballroom, and there were about 200 people between us. Leo was fiddling with his tablet, connecting it to something. Probably the hotel's wireless system, or maybe even the gala's own projection equipment. Ladies and gentlemen, Leo's voice suddenly boomed through the ballroom's sound system, amplified by microphones that were supposed to be used for the charity presentation. If I could have your attention for just a moment. The crowd turned toward him, probably expecting some kind of surprise announcement or maybe an impromptu speech about the evening's charitable cause. Gerald's face had gone the color of ash, and I could hear his panicked thoughts from 50 feet away. What the hell is he doing? How did he get access to? Leo held up his tablet with a grin that belonged in a horror movie. I think you'll all find this very interesting. especially those of you who've been wondering where exactly the Parker family's charitable donations have been going. The main projection screen at the front of the ballroom flickered to life, and suddenly everyone was staring at what looked like internal Parker Industries financial documents. Spreadsheets, bank transfers, shell company formations, the kind of paperwork that was never supposed to see the light of day, let alone get projected in front of 500 of the most influential people in the country. The ballroom erupted into chaos. People were pulling out their phones, taking pictures, recording videos. Evelyn looked like she was about to faint, while Dominic was pushing through the crowd toward Leo with murder in his eyes. The society reporters who'd been covering the event for their lifestyle sections suddenly realized they'd stumbled into the biggest financial scandal of the year. But here's the thing about having mind-reading powers. You get to hear the real story behind the chaos. Finn Parker, Gerald's younger brother and the family's head of security, was already on his phone, his thoughts racing as he tried to trace where the information had come from. Check Leo's device history. Check the upload logs. Find out how he got access to these files. Lucas was thinking damage control. How much of this is real? How much can we discredit? We need lawyers, PR specialists, and probably a small army of fixers. But it was Marissa's mental voice that caught my attention, because instead of panic, I heard something that sounded a lot like satisfaction mixed with fear. Perfect. Let Leo take the fall while everyone focuses on the financials. By the time they figure out the real source, it'll be too late. The real source. Leo wasn't the mastermind here. He was the fall guy. Finn must have been thinking along the same lines, because his mental commentary suddenly shifted. Leo's device, but the upload originated from Wait. This came from inside the family network. Someone with access uploaded this to Leo's tablet remotely. Hotel security was already moving toward Leo, and you could practically see him realizing that he was about to become the scapegoat for something way bigger than he'd signed up for. His face went from triumphant to terrified in about 3 seconds flat. I didn't mean, someone sent me these files, he was shouting as security grabbed his arms. Someone inside the family. I can prove it. But nobody was listening to his protests. The crowd was too busy gossiping about the financial revelations, and the Parker family was too busy going into crisis mode to care about Leo's claims of innocence. Finn checked his phone again, and I caught his discovery loud and clear. Upload traced to Marissa's personal device. Last night, 11:47 p.m. Marissa's face went white as Finn whispered something in Gerald's ear. Gerald's expression shifted from panic to fury so fast, it was like watching a switch flip. Get them both. Gerald's thoughts were ice cold. Leo and Marissa. Now, security moved through the crowd with military precision. Leo was already in custody, still protesting his innocence to anyone who would listen. But when they reached Marissa, she tried to run. She made it maybe 10 feet before 2 very large men in very expensive suits blocked her path. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the youngest Parker daughter was escorted out of her own family's charity gala, screaming about being framed and demanding that someone call her lawyer. Adrian set me up, she was shouting as they dragged her toward the exit. He's been planning this. He framed us both. The accusation hung in the air for about 30 seconds before everyone's attention shifted back to the much more interesting financial documents still glowing on the projection screen. Nobody believed her. Why would they? I was just the new son-in-law, the guy who'd married into the family and was trying to save a failing business division. What possible motive would I have for exposing the family's secrets? As the evening wound down and the crowd slowly dispersed, probably to spend the rest of the night gossiping about what they'd witnessed, I found myself alone with Evelyn near the bar. The projection screen had finally been turned off, hotel staff was cleaning up the chaos, and the Parker family was regrouping like generals after a particularly brutal battle. Evelyn looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through my carefully maintained innocent act. You knew, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. I suspected, I admitted. But proof always hangs itself. She studied my face for a long moment, and I could hear her mental gears turning. Maybe this one is dangerous, in the right way. High praise from the Parker matriarch. As we left the plaza and headed back to the estate, I realized something important. Tonight hadn't just been about exposing family secrets or getting rid of threats. It had been a test, a way to see how I'd handle a crisis, how I'd react when the family was under attack. And apparently, I'd passed with flying colors. 6 months. That's how long it took me to turn Subsidiary 3 from a corporate zombie into something that actually resembled a functioning business. 6 months of 18-hour days, stress eating, and more coffee than any human being should legally consume. But when the quarterly reports came in, the numbers didn't lie. We weren't just profitable, we were kicking ass and taking names. The transformation had been nothing short of miraculous, if I do say so myself. Our client retention rate had gone from a pathetic 37% to a respectable 84%. We'd landed 12 new contracts in the mid-market space, exactly where I'd predicted we could dominate. Revenue was up 130% from the same period last year, and for the first time in 3 years, Subsidiary 3 was actually contributing to the Parker family's bottom line instead of bleeding money like a stuck pig. I was sitting in my office, staring at the latest numbers on my computer screen and trying not to look too smug about the whole thing, when Margaret, Evelyn's assistant and general harbinger of family drama, appeared in my doorway with that particular expression that meant someone important wanted to see me. "Mrs. Parker would like to see you in the main conference room," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of formal politeness that suggested this wasn't really a request. "At your earliest convenience." In Parker family speak, "at your earliest convenience" meant drop whatever you're doing and get your ass over here right now. So I grabbed my jacket and headed for the main house. The conference room was buzzing with activity when I arrived. The entire Parker clan was there: Gerald, Evelyn, Dominic, Lucas, Selena, along with what looked like half the senior management team and a few people I didn't recognize, but who carried themselves like they owned small countries. This wasn't just a family meeting. This was a full-scale corporate work council. "Adrian," Evelyn called out as I entered, her voice carrying a warmth that I'd never heard before. Perfect timing. We were just discussing the quarterly results. She gestured to the presentation screen at the front of the room, which was displaying a series of charts and graphs that looked like they'd been designed by someone who really enjoyed making other people feel inadequate. Revenue projections, market analysis, competitive positioning, all the corporate porn that business schools use to justify their tuition fees. But there, right in the middle of all those fancy charts, was a section devoted entirely to Subsidiary 3. Our numbers, our growth projections, our success story laid out in full corporate glory for everyone to see. "As you can see," Gerald was saying, his voice carrying the kind of grudging respect that rich men reserve for people who'd proven them wrong, "Subsidiary 3 has exceeded all expectations. Not only has Adrian managed to turn around a failing division, but he's done it ahead of schedule and above projected targets." I could hear the mental commentary flowing around the room like a Greek chorus of corporate amazement. Dominic's thoughts were particularly entertaining. Not useless after all. Actually managed to pull it off. Didn't see that coming. Lucas was thinking along different lines. Smart move, picking the division nobody else wanted. Now he's got something to bargain with. Even Selena seemed impressed, though her mental response was characteristically calculating. He's becoming more than I planned. This could be useful or dangerous. Which brings us to tonight's agenda. Evelyn continued, and suddenly all eyes in the room were focused on me. "Adrian, you've proven yourself capable of turning around underperforming assets. We'd like to discuss expanding your role within the organization." Now, this was interesting. 6 months ago, these people had been treating me like some kind of corporate charity case, offering me an allowance and a pat on the head in exchange for staying out of their way. Now they were talking about expanding my role. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so dramatically I could practically feel it in the air. "What did you have in mind?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral even though my brain was doing cartwheels. Gerald leaned forward, his expression serious. "We're prepared to offer you a permanent position as Vice President of Strategic Development, with oversight of all underperforming divisions and a seat on the executive committee." Holy shit. 6 months ago, I was lucky to get invited to family dinners. Now they were offering me a real position with actual power and influence. The mental reactions around the room were a fascinating mix of respect, calculation, and barely concealed jealousy. The compensation package would be substantial, Evelyn added, sliding a folder across the table. Base salary, performance bonuses, equity participation. All the standard executive benefits. I opened the folder and tried not to let my jaw drop. The numbers were insane. More money than I'd ever dreamed of making, with benefits that included everything short of my own private jet. But more importantly, this wasn't just a job offer. This was acceptance, recognition, a real seat at the big kids' table. This is very generous, I said, closing the folder and looking around the room. But I have a question. Gerald raised an eyebrow, which is, what happened to the marriage contract? The one where I was supposed to get nothing if subsidiary 3 failed. The room got quiet, the kind of quiet that happens when someone brings up something everyone was hoping to ignore. I could practically hear the mental gears grinding as they tried to figure out how to handle this particular wrinkle. That contract, Evelyn said carefully, was based on the assumption that subsidiary 3 would continue to underperform. Since you've exceeded all expectations, we feel it's appropriate to renegotiate terms. Translation: they'd bet against me and lost, and now they were trying to figure out how to keep me happy without admitting they'd been wrong. I appreciate that, I said, but I'd like to propose something different. Here we go again. Another negotiation, another chance to push the boundaries and see how far I could go. I don't want to renegotiate the original contract, I continued. I want to honor it exactly as written. I turned subsidiary 3 profitable within 12 months, which means I get my 10% ownership stake. But I'd like to add something to the deal. Dominic's mental response was immediate. Here it comes. He's going to try to leverage this into something bigger. What kind of addition? Gerald asked, his voice carefully neutral. A partnership, I said simply. Not just with subsidiary 3, but with the entire Parker organization. I want to be treated as an equal partner, not just another employee on the payroll. The silence that followed was so profound you could have heard a stock price drop. I was essentially asking to be brought into the inner circle of one of the most powerful families on the East Coast, based on 6 months of success with a division they'd been ready to shut down. But here's the thing about the Parker family. They respected power, and success was the ultimate form of power. I'd proven that I could deliver results, that I could handle pressure, and that I wasn't going to fold under their particular brand of psychological warfare. Finn Parker, who'd been quiet throughout the entire meeting, suddenly spoke up. No more convenience marriage, he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a momentous decision. A real partnership. His thoughts were crystal clear. This man could be my equal. Finally, someone who understands how the game is really played. The room held its breath as Gerald and Evelyn exchanged glances. This wasn't just about business anymore. This was about family, about power, about who got to sit at the head of the table when the Parker empire made its next move. Very well, Evelyn said finally, her voice carrying the kind of finality that suggested the decision had been made. Equal partnership it is. That night, as Selena and I sat in our bedroom, our actual shared bedroom, for the first time since our wedding night, she asked the question I'd been expecting. Do you regret this marriage? I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that somewhere along the way, the dynamic between us had fundamentally changed. We weren't playing house anymore, weren't pretending to be something we weren't. We were two people who'd found themselves in an unusual situation and were trying to figure out how to make it work. No, I said honestly. I don't regret it. Her mental response was immediate. He's becoming more than I planned. Can I control him still? The answer, I realized, was no. She couldn't control me anymore, and neither could the rest of the Parker family. I'd proven myself, carved out my own space, and established my own power base within their empire. For the first time since our wedding day, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The greenhouse summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the kind of formal politeness that meant serious business was about to go down. Evelyn Parker didn't invite people to her private greenhouse for casual chats about the weather. This was her inner sanctum, the place where the real decisions got made and where she could speak freely without worrying about corporate lawyers or board members recording every word for posterity. I found her among the orchids, tending to some exotic bloom that probably cost more than most people's cars. She was wearing gardening gloves that looked like they'd never seen actual dirt, and her silver hair was pulled back in the kind of elegant bun that screamed, "I run empires in my spare time." The greenhouse itself was like something out of a botanical fever dream. Rare plants from 6 continents, climate control systems that could probably terraform Mars, and enough natural light to power a small city. "Adrian," she said without looking up from her flowers, "thank you for coming." "Always a pleasure, Evelyn," I replied, though we both knew this wasn't about pleasure. This was about power and the careful redistribution of it within the Parker family hierarchy. She finally turned to face me, her expression unreadable but her mental voice crystal clear. He can smile in front of cameras and bare teeth in silence. He is my heir in spirit. Her heir in spirit. Holy shit. You've proven yourself over the past months, she continued out loud, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made politicians wet themselves. Not just with Subsidiary 3, but with how you've handled the family dynamics, the external pressures, the various complications that have arisen. By complications, she meant everything from Marissa's sabotage attempts to the charity gala scandal to the general clusterfuck of trying to integrate an outsider into one of the most insular families on the eastern seaboard. Which is why, she said, moving to another section of rare blooms, I'm putting you in charge of the Parker Foundation. The Parker Foundation. The family's public face, their charitable arm, and the vehicle through which they exercise soft power across 3 states and half a dozen industries. It wasn't just about writing checks to worthy causes. It was about influence, about relationships, about being able to pick up the phone and make things happen at the highest levels of government and business. That's quite an honor, I said, trying to keep my voice steady even though my brain was doing victory laps. It's quite a responsibility, she corrected. The foundation handles over $200 million in annual giving. We fund everything from medical research to educational initiatives to disaster relief. Every decision you make will be scrutinized by the media, by our competitors, and by people who would love nothing more than to see the Parker family stumble. I nodded, understanding the weight of what she was offering. This wasn't just a job. It was a test of whether I could handle being the public face of the Parker empire, whether I could navigate the treacherous waters of high-stakes philanthropy without drowning the family's reputation in the process. From now on, Evelyn continued, you'll run the foundation in public. Press conferences, donor meetings, board presentations. You'll be the face that people associate with Parker charitable giving. The implications were staggering. 6 months ago, I'd been lucky to get invited to family dinners. Now I was being positioned as the public representative of one of the most powerful philanthropic organizations in the country. That week, I threw myself into the role like my life depended on it, which, honestly, it probably did. The Parker Foundation operated out of a gleaming office building in Midtown Manhattan, all glass and steel and expensive art that screamed, "We have more money than God, and we're not afraid to show it." The staff was a mixture of idealistic do-gooders who genuinely believed in making the world a better place and cynical political operators who understood that charity was just another form of power projection. My first major initiative was launching a new scholarship program for first-generation college students, kids whose parents had never set foot on a university campus, but who had the brains and drive to succeed if given the chance. It was the kind of feel-good story that the media loved, and it positioned the Parker family as champions of the American dream rather than just another dynasty hoarding wealth like dragons guarding gold. But I also made some strategic personnel changes that sent a clear message about how things were going to operate under my leadership. I brought back 3 employees who'd been quietly forced out during the previous administration, people whose only crime had been asking uncomfortable questions about where certain donations were really going. I restructured the investment committee to include more diverse voices and fewer cronies. And I launched a transparency initiative that published detailed financial reports about every dollar the foundation spent. The press ate it up. Within a month, I was being profiled in Forbes as the Iron Groom, the outsider who'd married into one of America's most powerful families and was now reshaping their public image from the inside. The New York Times ran a piece about the new generation of philanthropic leadership. Even the Wall Street Journal, which usually treated charity work like some kind of quaint hobby for rich people with too much time on their hands, devoted editorial space to praising the foundation's innovative approach to strategic giving. But the real test came when Marissa crawled back. She showed up at my office on a Thursday afternoon, looking like she'd been through a blender made of legal proceedings and public humiliation. The charity gala scandal had destroyed her reputation, and the subsequent investigation into her financial dealings had left her radioactive in social circles that used to kiss her ass on a regular basis. "Adrian," she said, perching on the edge of the chair across from my desk like she was afraid I might call security if she got too comfortable. I wanted to apologize. Her words were honey, pure sweetness and contrition flowing like maple syrup over pancakes. She talked about how Leo had manipulated her, how she'd been naive and trusting, how she'd learned from her mistakes and was ready to make amends. But her thoughts? Her thoughts were venom distilled into pure hatred. If he lets me near, I'll gut his empire from inside. I'll destroy everything he's built and make him watch. I let her finish her performance, and it was a performance worthy of a Tony nomination for Best Actress in a Bullshit Drama, before responding. Marissa, I said, leaning back in my chair and giving her the kind of smile that politicians used when they were about to deliver bad news. I appreciate you coming here. I really do. She brightened, probably thinking she'd successfully manipulated her way back into the family's good graces. But here's the thing, I continued, my voice never losing its pleasant tone. You taught me something incredibly valuable about survival in this family. You taught me that everyone has an agenda, that trust is a luxury that can get you killed, and that the only way to protect yourself is to always be 3 steps ahead of whoever's trying to destroy you. Her smile faltered as she realized where this was going. So thank you for the education, I said, standing up and moving toward the door. But you'll never step into my life again. The mask slipped completely, revealing the pure rage underneath. You can't do this to me, she hissed. I'm family. No, I said, opening the door and gesturing for her to leave. You're a cautionary tale. She left in silence, but I could hear her mental screaming all the way to the elevator. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my office, looking out at the Manhattan skyline and reflecting on how much my life had changed. 6 months ago, I'd been a nobody trying to figure out how to survive in a world that was designed to chew me up and spit me out. Now I was running a $200 million foundation, reshaping the public image of one of America's most powerful families, and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. The mind-reading thing had been the catalyst, sure, but the real transformation had come from learning to play the game on my own terms. I wasn't just surviving in the Parker family anymore. I was thriving, and I was doing it by being smarter, more strategic, and more ruthless than anyone had expected. Tomorrow, I had a meeting with the mayor about a new urban development initiative. Next week, I was scheduled to testify before a congressional subcommittee about philanthropic reform. Next month, I'd be keynoting a conference about the future of charitable giving. Not bad for a guy who'd started this journey as wedding decoration for a family that collected powerful men like trophies. Not bad at all. The boardroom felt different this time. 6 months ago, I'd sat at the far end of this same mahogany table like some kind of corporate mascot, nodding along while the real players made the real decisions. Now I was sitting 3 seats from the head, with my own nameplate and my own stack of quarterly reports that actually mattered. Gerald Parker was wrapping up the meeting with his usual dry precision, running through numbers that would make most people's heads spin. But when he got to my section, the foundation's performance metrics and subsidiary threes continued growth. His tone shifted to something that almost resembled pride. What Adrian accomplished in 6 months, he said, looking directly at me with those sharp blue eyes that had intimidated CEOs and politicians for decades, others failed to do in 6 years. The admission hung in the air like expensive cologne. This was Gerald Parker, the man who'd built an empire from scratch, who'd never met a weakness he couldn't exploit or a competitor he couldn't crush, publicly acknowledging that the guy everyone had written off as wedding decoration had actually delivered results. I thought back to my wedding day, standing at that altar while my brand new superpower kicked in for the first time. The moment when I'd heard Selena's real thoughts about getting the better deal than her sister, when I'd realized that every smile in that cathedral was hiding something ugly underneath. That first day of hearing people's true thoughts had been like getting a backstage pass to the world's most brutal reality show. But it had also been my second chance, my opportunity to rewrite the story of my life with inside information that nobody knew I possessed. Now, as I looked around the boardroom at faces that had once dismissed me as a temporary inconvenience, I could hear the mental shift in their assessment of who Adrian Matthews really was. Dominic's thoughts were grudging but clear. Not the weak link we expected. Actually useful. Lucas was thinking strategically. Need to recalibrate how I approach him. He's not going anywhere. Even Evelyn, the iron-willed matriarch who'd seen dozens of fortune hunters come and go, was thinking. Finally, someone who understands the game. That night, Selena and I sat across from each other at dinner. Really sat across from each other, not just occupying the same space while thinking about other things. The dynamic between us had evolved from awkward strangers playing house to something that almost resembled a real partnership. You know, she said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision, I never expected this. Expected what? You. She looked up from her plate, and for once, her mental voice matched her spoken words. Maybe I underestimated you. Maybe I need you more than you need me. I raised my wine glass in a mock toast. To unexpected outcomes. She smiled. A real smile, not the magazine-perfect expression she usually wore, and clinked her glass against mine. Being reborn hadn't just been about gaining the ability to read minds. It had been about learning to see past the surface, to understand that everyone was playing a game, and that the only way to win was to play it better than anyone expected. I wasn't the weak groom who'd stumbled into a family of sharks anymore. I wasn't the convenient husband who could be discarded when his usefulness expired. I wasn't living in anyone's shadow, following anyone's script, or dancing to anyone's tune. I was Adrian Matthews, Vice President of Strategic Development, Director of the Parker Foundation, and equal partner in one of the most powerful families on the Eastern Seaboard. I was the guy who'd taken a failing business division and turned it into a profit center. I was the man who'd survived corporate sabotage, family warfare, and public scandals without breaking a sweat. Most importantly, I was the architect of my own fate. And every whisper in every room proved that I was no longer just surviving in this world. I was conquering it.